Hello, Documentation Nation. Welcome back to our Next.js series. We're picking up right where we left off with pre-rendering and data fetching. We have already covered the introduction, setup, and link component, and utilizing CSS within Next.js framework. So if you haven't seen those already, I'll link up top to the playlist so you can go ahead and catch up with us. And so far, it looks like we have 260 points, so we're rocking and rolling over here. Pre-rendering and data fetching. We'd like to create a blog. We have the desired result, which we looked at before, but we'll open this up again. Why not? Here's our sample blog. But so far, we've added no blog content. In this lesson, we'll learn how to fetch external blog data into our app. We'll store the blog content in the file system, but it'll work if the content is stored elsewhere, like a database or headless CMS. Things we'll learn in this lesson. We're going to learn about Next.js's pre-rendering feature, the two forms of pre-rendering, static generation and server-side rendering, static generation with data and without data, getStaticProps, and how to use it to import external blog data into the index page, and some useful information on getStaticProps. So I'm excited. Let's go. We're continuing from the previous lesson. We are. If you are not, there is some instruction here about downloading starter code, which is listed as optional, I guess, because we are continuing the previous lesson, right? So go ahead and catch up with us with that download, and we're rolling right along. Pre-rendering. Before we talk about data fetching, let's talk about one of the most important concepts in Next.js, pre-rendering. By default, Next.js pre-renders every page. This means that Next.js generates HTML for each page in advance, instead of having it all done by client-side JavaScript. Pre-rendering can result in better performance and search engine optimization. Each generated HTML is associated with minimal JavaScript code necessary for that page. When a page is loaded by the browser, its JavaScript code runs and makes the page fully interactive. This process is called hydration. So there's a paragraph here about how to check that pre-rendering is actually happening. I'm just going to go ahead and trust that it is and not run through the steps. But if you'd like to do that, go ahead. Let us know in the comments how that worked out for you. If your app is a plain react.js app without Next.js, there is no pre-rendering, so you won't be able to see the app if you disable JavaScript, for example. Enable JavaScript in your browser and check out this page. Yeah, I'm good. I understand this. I don't want to experiment with it. I want to just continue on with learning this framework. Graphical summary here is nice though, huh? Pre-rendering using Next.js. Pre-rendered HTML is displayed. And then hydration, React components are initialized and app becomes interactive. No pre-rendering. If there's no JavaScript, nothing's gonna actually render. Which of the following is not a benefit of pre-rendering? We know there's improved SEO. We know it allows your application to work without JavaScript, at least immediately, right? Allows your application to only run server-side, which is not a thing that they have told us about this yet, so we're rocking and rolling, keep going. Please bring me to actual stuff soon. Pre-rendering and data fetching, two forms of pre-rendering. Next.js has two forms of pre-rendering, static generation and server-side rendering. The difference is in when it generates the HTML for the page. Static generation is the pre-rendering method that generates the HTML at build time. Pre-rendered HTML is then reused on each request. Server-side rendering is the pre-rendering method that generates the HTML on each request. So let's see if this helps us out a little bit with our understanding here. Static generation, the HTML is generated at build time and is reused for each request, right? So we have our build. Next.js builds the application for production, HTML is generated and then reused for each request to that server from our individual clients over here. Server-side rendering, the HTML is generated on each request. So a user has a page request, it hits Next.js, HTML is generated and sent back to the user. I don't fully understand the point of having this twice, but okay, I think we understand the cycle here, right? So we have pre-rendering in development mode. And going into production, static generation will only happen once at build time, not on every request. Okay. Per page basis, importantly, Next.js lets you choose which pre-rendering form to use for each page. You can create a hybrid Next.js app by using static generation for most pages and using server-side rendering for others. Okay, so we know it does both things. We know we're going to have the ability to choose which it does and when. This is the thing that I think is going to be the most valuable to us in learning this framework, is when to use static generation and server-side rendering. The previous explanations gave us an idea of what that's all about, but I don't know, just knowing the definitions, what what really makes sense to do. So the Next.js team recommends using static generation with and without data whenever possible, because your page can be built once and served by CDN, which makes it much faster than having a server render the page on every request. You can use static generations for many types of pages, including marketing pages, blog posts, e-commerce, help and docs. You should ask yourself, can I pre-render this page ahead of a user's request? If the answer is yes, then you should choose static generation. On the other hand, static generation is not a good idea if you cannot pre-render a page ahead of a user's request. Maybe your page shows frequently updated data and the page content changes on every request. In that case, use server-side rendering. It'll be slower, but the pre-rendered page will always be up to date. Or you can skip pre-rendering and use client-side JavaScript to populate frequently updated data. Okay, so maybe this is something like if we have like a stock ticker or something, static generation isn't a great idea, right? Because that's going to be something that's going to be constantly updating data. So if we have static generation, that might be out of date. Something similar. I don't know. I wish they would give me more in-depth examples here. Great to know the things that I can use static generation on, but give me something as an example of what I really shouldn't be using it on. But I think we get the general idea, right? And also, I don't know, you're going to trial and error the stuff too, right? If you were static generation, or if you choose server-side rendering and it doesn't do what you need it to do, then you do static generation. And also, I think that might have to do with like server loads and things like that too, right? Do you really want server-side rendering for the majority of your stuff and more communication with a server? Probably not. But we'll focus on static generation. In this lesson, we'll focus on static generation. On the next page, we'll talk about static generation with and without data. Okay, when would you use server-side rendering? You have thousands of pages, when the data needs to be up to date with every request, when you are building a page specific to a user. Well, we already know when the data needs to be up to date with every request. That is basically when we want this, right? That's what it tells us up here. It's not a good idea if you need frequently updated data. Correct, good job, we're learning. Oh, I want to code. Maybe we'll get there soon. Static generation with and without data. Static generation can be done with and without data. Cool. I can't not giggle at some of the repetitiveness of like, here's the title, and then the first sentence is exactly what the title is. So far, all the pages we've created do not require fetching external data. Those pages will automatically be statically generated when the app is built for production. Okay, so I don't get the choice there. If I'm not fetching data, it's just immediately static, which is fine, right? I think that's good. Optimize that for me. Don't make me think about it. Static generation without data. For pages that can be generated without fetching external data at build time. Next.js builds the app for production. HTML is generated, no fetching. Cool. However, for some pages, you might not be able to render the HTML without first fetching some external data. Maybe you need to access the file system, fetch external API, or query your database at build time. Next.js supports this case, static generation with data out of the box. I don't know, it's telling me a whole lot on the capability without really giving me a work through the examples, right? I feel like I'd rather do this in reverse order. I'd rather work through the examples first or see some of this in action and then kind of dive into what all this text is. I think I would have me personally, a better learning experience getting the hands-on and then kind of reading the theory and going through the text and document more so. Static generation with data using getStaticProps. How does it work? Well, in Next.js, when you export a page component, you can also export an async function called getStaticProps. If you do this, then getStaticProps runs at build time in production, and inside the function, you can fetch external data and send it as props to the page. So here we have our first actual coding example. Export default function home, and there's props, and then whatever our code's going to be here. Export async function, getStaticProps. Get external data from the file system, API, database, etc. We get our data back from whatever our API call is or whatever our external fetch call is. Return props. The value of the props key will be passed to the home component. Okay, maybe it's just me. I don't love examples like this that are just kind of code in space. Yeah, cool. I can start to understand the concept, but until I really know what's going on around this code and how this is even living in an application, I'm really confused about what this is going to be. Essentially, getStaticProps allows you to tell Next.js, hey, this page has some data dependencies. So when you pre-render this page at build time, make sure to resolve them first. Development mode runs on each request. Okay, so let's use getStaticProps. Yes, it is easier to learn by doing. Yes. Why go through the trouble of telling me all this stuff first? And then tell me exactly what I wanted to do in the first place. So start from using the next page. We'll get static props to implement on our blog. Okay. I'm like 15 minutes in and I haven't done anything except for read out loud. It sucks. The blog posts in our example will be stored as local markdown files in our applications directory, not fetched from an external data source. So we'll need to read the data from the file system. In this section, we'll go through the steps of creating a blog that reads markdown data from the file system. Cool, this is a little bit repetitive, but we're there. Creating the markdown files. First, create a new top-level directory called posts. This is not the same as pages/posts in your root folder. Okay, and then we're going to create some two markdown files. So in our root folder, which is this next.js-blog, we're going to create a new directory called posts. And then within there, we're going to create two files, pre-rendering markdown and ssg-ssr markdown. Now copy the following code to the pre-rendering file. Boom. There's our beautiful markdown. And here's the one for the ssg-ssr. And we can see these are the two posts that we have here, right? And this is when to use static generation. And this is the two forms of pre-rendering those posts that we've got on our example. You might have noticed that each markdown file has a metadata section at the top containing title and date. This is called YAML front matter, which can be parsed using a library called gray matter. Oh, we're going to install gray matter. Cool, let's do that. So we're going to open our integrated terminal here with Control tilde is the keyboard shortcut. First install gray matter, which lets us parse the metadata in each markdown file. Is this the only thing this thing does? I'm not familiar with what this is. Parse front matter from a string or file. Okay, cool. What does this do? I see. So this is basically just going to turn our markdown file into an object, which is interesting because I was already getting confused of like, why are we using a markdown file to, like, how am I going to work with that when we do some data manipulation here? But this makes a lot of sense, right? Okay, got our terminal open, npm I gray matter. Oh, you know what? I am not in my root. So let's actually get into our root here. And now we can do it. Cool, excellent, there we go. Creating the utility function to read the file system. Next, we'll create a utility function for parsing data from the file system. With this utility function, we'd like to, 1, parse each markdown file and get the title, date, and file name, which will be used as ID for the post URL. We saw that in our first video when we started going through and clicking and noticing the URL here, the ssg-ssr is there. And here we've got the URL here of pre-rendering. And 2, list the data on the index page sorted by date. So create another top level directory called lib library. Then inside library, create a full file called posts.js. And copy and paste this code. This is a bunch, so let's copy and paste this code and then let's try to go through it and see if we, you don't need to understand what the code above is doing in order to learn Next.js. I would love to though. This is the point of Documentation Nation. So we've got import fs from fs for reading and managing files. So we've got import path from path and import matter from gray matter. So here we're declaring a variable const posts directory equals path.join, and we've got process.cwd current working directory, and we're going to the posts directory, which is this one, right, that we just added our markdown files to, not pages, posts. So we'll collapse pages so we don't get confused. And we're exporting a function get sorted post data. So we have some comments here, which is nice to help us out. Get file names /posts. So another variable we declare of file names, which is s.read directory sync of post directory, which is just the path that we declared before. Reads the contents of the directory is what this dot read directory sync is doing. And then all post data we're declaring equals file names dot map. So we're mapping through each of the files in the directory that we just read with this up here. So for each file name, we're removing the .md from the file name to get the ID. So all this is doing, this is just saying now declare a variable ID. Const ID is for each file name, just replace the .md at the end with nothing. So then you are just left with, you know, if we're looking at our posts, right, and the ID would just be ssg-ssr is stored in this ID variable. Read markdown file as a string. So declaring a full path equals path.join posts directory, which was our original directory that we created. And then file name, we're still in this mapping function, right? So we're getting an ID, we're getting the path, right? Which is just going to be your, you know, whatever / posts / pre-rendering .md, right? This isn't the one without the .md on there. This is the full entire thing. And then we use that full path that we just got, fs.read file, saying synchronously reads the entire contents of a file. So then all of that data, let's say in ssg-ssr, goes into full contents. I don't know what UTF-8 is. What is UTF-8? Encoding? Okay. And then we have another variable we declare use gray matter to parse. So now we have our entire contents of that file, and we pass them over to gray matter with the function matter and put our file contents in there. And this effectively turns that data into the object that we saw before, right? On this example, turning our data into, turning this into this, right? And that gets stored in matter results. And then we return, finally, from our map, an object where we put the ID up front that we stored originally, and matter results dot data, which is this part of the post, right? So not even the entire content, just the data that we saw between these lines here. That's what we return into all post data, right? Which is itself going to be an array, right? Mapping returns an array. So if we look at the map method on MDN, we confirm, right? We create a new array with all that data. So this creates an array, right? Returns an array. So our all post data, which was our big map function that we get here, as we return each of these objects, we create an array with the object in it with the ID, and then the results, it's spreading the result.data. So it spreads this object into that object, right? So now we just have title of whatever, and this, we're not gonna slug, but whatever, what is our thing? Title and date, you know, 11/1/ whatever it is. That would be the first one, and then we get another comma, another object within that array for however many posts we have. In this case, we have posts 2, so this is a second ID, second title of whatever 2, and then the date of, you know, whatever, I don't care. I'm going to wrap this so we can see this a little bit better. We get the point of what we're looking at here, right? And now that we have an array, we can use the array method sort on this thing. And this is just giving us an ascending, I guess you would say, a date oldest or newest to oldest, right? Let's go look at sort. So if a dot date, we're looking at sort. If a dot date is less than b dot date, return 1, otherwise return -1. So if we return a value that is greater than 0, and sort a after b, right? If it's less than 0, sort a before b. So okay, we were instructed that it wasn't important to know what the hell was happening here, but I think it's important that we know what's happening here. Otherwise, all this is just nonsense, and we should take the time to review and get it, right? So in effect, what do we see here? We have a large function here that's mapping through all of our data, and basically extracting the ID from the file name and parsing the file with matter into an array of objects, and then we sort that array in date order for whatever our needs are here to display them in the order we want them to appear. Cool, excellent. Oh, let's see, I didn't look at any of this as we were going through that. FS is a node module that lets you read files from the file system. Cool. Path is a Node.js module that lets you manipulate the file paths. Great. If you're not familiar with any of these, or if it's been a while for you, like it was for me in using these, here you go. And also we kind of just used our context clues there, right? Matter is a library that we just looked at. Don't need to read that. Man, it's so tempting sometimes still to just skip over this code. But this is the reason for doing documentation nation for me, was to slow down and get better at reading stuff like this. So now that blog data is parsed, we need to add it to our index page, pages/index.js. We can do this with next.js data fetching method called getStaticProps, which we were reading about previously. In the next section, we'll learn how to implement getStaticProps. So parse markdown files. Here is their image display of the array of objects that we just went through the code and understood that we are returning. Pass an array of post data into the page component as props. Show the list of blog posts on the index page, which is this right here, right? So we're going to end up displaying that array in some way. Implement getStaticProps. Pre-rendering in next.js. Next.js has two forms of pre-rendering: static generation and server-side rendering. I think we get it. The difference is in when it generates the HTML for a page. Static generation is the pre-rendering method that generates. Okay, cool. I understand. Static generation, build time, server side, each request. Server side's like old school, right? Importantly, Next.js lets you choose which pre-rendering form to use on each page. You can create a hybrid Next.js app by using static generation for most pages and using server-side rendering for others. Using static generation. Now we need to add an import for the getSortedPosts data and call it inside getStaticProps in the pages/index.js. So I'm assuming when they say pages/index.js, they mean pages posts index.js. That's what they had us do last time. So maybe I'm wrong, but now we need to add an import for getSortedProps. GetSortedPosts data and call it inside getStaticProps. Open pages/index.js in your editor and add the following code above the exported home component. So here is our home component. We want to add this code up here, right? So we're going to import getSortedPosts data. There we go, from our library/posts. And then we're also going to export an async function called getStaticProps. Right, where we'll declare a variable, all posts data equals the getSortedPosts data we just brought in, and that is a function. So we're going to invoke that function, and then within this we return an object which has a key of props. And the value of props is an object of the all posts data that we declared above. So this is just like following the process, right? This is getStaticProps, which is typing out as a promise here. Thank you, TypeScript. And what we're returning is the object, right, which has the props, and is just the way that Next.js handles this particular function. By returning all post data inside the props object in getStaticProps, the blog post will be passed to the home component as a prop. Now you can access the blog posts like so. So hold on, let's dig into what this means. By returning all post data inside the props object, which is what we're doing here, this is the object, the blog post will be passed to the home component. So now we just take this, and it doesn't just happen automatically, right? I don't know why they're making, I think this was just worded a little bit confusing for me. So this says, by returning all post data inside the props object in getStaticProps, the blog post will be passed to the home component as a prop. which is not true until you pass it as a prop, right? Which means like you have to put it here. Returning this doesn't automatically pass it until you set it up and access it. Maybe it's just me. I just don't like the wording of that. All posts data, right? That is what we're passing through here, right? It's in the same file, so it's not like I have to pass this through somewhere else, but it still needs this in order to access, right? That variable. So there we go. Now we can access all post data within this, right? And you know what I haven't done yet, which is going to take a billion years to set up? Have not started our server, and I don't know if it's actually going to boot up that quickly for us. Last time I did this, it took forever. Okay, cool. I hit an error at first because I was missing some punctuation over here. So if you do the same, make sure you've got your comma, semicolon set up. And there's our boy Dale Cooper from our previous setup. So cool. Looks like we're on the right track here. So to display blog post, let's update the home component and add another section tag with the data below, the section with your self-introduction. Don't forget to also change the props from this to this, right? Now they're telling us to do it twice. I don't know. Whatever. I guess it's a nice reminder in case we're trying to speed through this thing. So we're being told to add another section down here. And there's a bunch of stuff here that they want us to put in here. I kind of want to just walk through this so we can take a look at what's happening, right? So we've got the section, we're going to have class name, and we're going to use JavaScript to figure this thing out, and a template literal, and we've got some util styles, right, from our previous thing. Heading MD is the one we had from that, right, which was just a, what was the file here? Util styles, utils module, right? I think that's the one. Yeah. So we've got from utils module CSS, refresh our memory, here's our CSS file, and we're using this particular one, which just increases font size and line height. And then within that class name, we also have util styles.padding 1 pixel, which was this one that just adds 1 pixel of padding to the top. And we have an H2 in here that we are doing some more class name stuff with. Heading, I don't like that I can't autocomplete this stuff, but that's okay. This is going to say a blog. And then we have an unordered list, which has its own utility class from the module that we've imported. Still styles.list, right? And now we're actually going to get into our mapping function from all post data. Map, that's the array that we had before. And in here, we are destructuring. We've got ID, date, and title. And we get to our actual function, and we are just first going to display, we have a a list item here, which there we go, Emmett, thank you. The class name, pulling from our utility file again, util styles.list item, and we have a key. React loves the keys for whenever we're mapping over anything, and they're using the ID here. And within this list item, we're going to display the title that we are mapping through using a break. The ID that we have, I can type ID using another break, and then our date. And that looks like everything. And if I didn't mistype something, we should, if we go back to here we go. We have the title, we have the ID, and we have the date. So remember that we go back and we look at our other file that I closed, silly. We looked at that array that we have with each object, right, that has the ID, the title, and the date. So we know why we're using .map to go through the array, and we see how we destructure the things within that object. Right, rather than doing something like for each post, right, and then you would have done like post.title, right, to access within that object. But instead of doing that, we are destructuring the individual things within that object. So cool, awesome, I love it, I get it. You should now see blog data if you access. Yes, we do. Congratulations, we successfully fetched external data from the file system and pre-rendered the index page with this data. Cool. We have utilized a function to map through data that we have and return an array of objects that are sorted. We have imported that function with its return in a variable that we have declared. So this all post data is our array of objects. And then we, using this getStaticProps async function, return an object with the props key and the value, which is an object of all post data. And then we continue pre-rendering and data fetching. GetStaticProp details. Here's some essential information you should know about getStaticProps. Fetch external API or query a database. So in the library post.js, we've implemented getSortedPostData, which fetches data from the file system, but you can fetch the data from other sources like an external API endpoint, and it'll work just fine. So here we're just, instead of getting data from our library that we have access to immediately, this are just using the fetch command here and getting back that data, right? Next.js polyfills fetch, so you don't need to import it. That's cool. Also query the database directly, import some database, right? And they're going through a query with select and SQL querying, so that's interesting to know. getStaticProps only runs on the server side. It will never run on the client side. It won't be included in the JS bundle for the browser. I mean, you can write code such as direct database queries without them being sent to browsers. Well, that's interesting to know. That means the browser isn't actually making that call. It's the server that's making that call and then sending it with the code over. Sounds that way. Development versus production. In development, getStaticProp runs on every request. In production, it runs at build time. However, this behavior can be enhanced using the fallback key returned by getStaticPaths. This is meant to be run at build time. You won't be able to use data that's only available during request time, such as query parameters or HTTP headers. Okay, a lot of things to try to remember about this thing, but without actually running into the issues, I'm not going to remember them. It's just going to be a process of using things in experimentation and seeing what I break. getStaticProps can only be exported from a page. You can't export it from non-page files. Okay. So that means if we didn't have something here that we were rendering, I guess this is kind of like use effect and calling out to my database and just making a regular React application. So instead of running use effect, which happens at the time component mounts, this is just kind of doing a similar thing. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's kind of the way I'm understanding this. What if I need to fetch data at request time? Since static generation happens once at build time, it's not suitable for data that updates frequently or changes on every user request. In cases like this, where your data is likely to change, you can use server-side rendering. Let's learn more about server-side rendering in the next section. Quick review. Where does getStaticProps run? Server-side. Correct, good job. Okay, here's the last page in this particular section. We're almost done with pre-rendering and data fetching, and then we'll call this session, because we are learning a bunch of information here that we're not going to really remember, right? This is the hard thing about working through documentation. And just to try to get a handle on the functionality of this stuff is like, man, once I need to use it, then I'm going to go back in here, now that I know it's here, now that I am familiar with this stuff, and I'll be able to reread this and be like, oh yeah, cool, I remember how this works and I can implement the process. But until I do that, man, this is going to just be back here somewhere, but not really in my memory, easily retainable one time through. Fetching data at request time. If you need to fetch data at request time instead of at build time, you can try server-side rendering. Yeah, that's what we're talking about, right? Next.js fetches data, boom. To use server-side rendering, you need to export get server-side props instead of get static props. So we're doing the same thing, but it's called get server-side props. So I guess that just kind of understanding the difference between the two makes sense. Using get server-side props. Here's a starter code for server-side props. Not necessary for our blog example, so we won't be implementing it. That's okay. It's the exact same setup here, and we would just return the same exact way. We're just replacing this, and next.js is just going to do its thing that it knows it needs to do. Because get server-side props is called at request time, its parameter context, ooh, there is something additional. It contains Request-specific parameters. You should use getStaticProps only if you need to pre-render a page whose data must be fetched at request time. Time to first byte, TTFB, will be slower than getStaticProps because the server must compute the result on every request. The result cannot be cached by a CDN without extra configuration. So this is really just saying, like, if I refresh this page, it's going to call out every single time, right? In the exact same way that like a use effect just calling out to a server would do the same thing. As soon as I render that component, it's going to call out. It's going to call out. It's going to call out. If you do not need to pre-render the data, you can also use the following strategy called client-side rendering. Statically generate pre-render parts of the page that do not require external data. When a page loads, fetch external data from the client using JavaScript and populate the remaining parts. So here's a little image of what this is referring to: static generation without data plus fetch data on the client side. You can pre-render data. You can also pre-render without data and then load the data on the client side. Next.js builds the app for production. Here we go. Statically generate parts of the page that do not require data. We just load the request time, fetch the data, then populate. Okay. I don't know. I don't love the way some of this stuff is being explained. Maybe I'm just lacking some knowledge, being at the stage of my learning journey that I'm in, and okay. But it's not really giving me what I think I need to have to walk away from this feeling really confident about the differences and the benefits. Like, I generally understand the concepts, but I think this is going to take a couple times really going through to fully get everything that's happening here. This approach works well for dashboard pages, for example, because a dashboard is a private user-specific page. SEO is not relevant, and a page doesn't need to be pre-rendered. Data is frequently updated, which requires fast time. So, like, yeah, I think a lot of this stuff is mainly like SEO based, right? Like, if your website performs more efficiently, you're going to have a higher ranking in like Google, SEO stats and things like that. So that's why this stuff is important for us. SWR, the team behind Next.js has created a React hook for data fetching called SWR. Highly recommended if you're fetching data on the client side. And it was caching, revalidation, focus tracking, etc. Won't cover details here, but know that it exists if we ever need it. And there's some documentation, so cool. This one's been, for me, a rough one. It's important data to understand and to be able to utilize, but it was very dry content. I'm glad we took the time to go through code, because part of Documentation Nation's goal is reading code, getting better at reading code, getting better at understanding someone else's code, getting better at being able to go through and explain what's happening. Even if I'm goofing up a little bit here and there, this is the level I'm currently at in my journey. Let's answer our quick review, and then we'll call this one: when should you use client-side rendering? When you can pre-render the data ahead of a user's request, when you need to fetch data at request time instead of build time. Private user-specific pages where SEO is not relevant. This one. Yeah. So at least I'm getting the questions correct. I'm able to retain some of that information, but yeah, I don't know. This one made my brain hurt a little bit. I am ready for a break on this documentation. Next time we come back, we go to dynamic routes and then API routes, and then we get to deploy, and then we learn all this stuff about SEO, which will be, maybe we do that depending if it's just me reading stuff. I don't really want to do that, but we'll see. But this is the stuff I'm excited for: dynamic routes and API routes specifically. All right, Documentation Nation, if you can hear it in my voice, this one was a little bit draining. It's time to call this session. Thank you for joining me. We'll see you again on the next one.